The Massachusetts coastline disappeared into morning fog as Clara Hale pressed her forehead against the train window, watching everything familiar dissolve into memory. Her carpetbag sat wedged between her feet, hastily packed, poorly organized, containing almost nothing of value except her mother's silver hairbrush and 3 changes of clothing that wouldn't survive a Wyoming winter. She knew that already, just like she knew she was making a mistake. But mistakes were a luxury her family couldn't afford anymore. "Miss, you'll want to eat something." The porter appeared beside her seat, offering a tin of crackers that probably cost more than she should spend. "Long journey ahead. Kansas City's 2 days out, and you've got another week past that." Clara shook her head, managing a polite smile that felt like broken glass in her throat. "I'm fine, thank you." She wasn't fine. She was 22 years old and traveling alone toward a marriage arranged through newspaper advertisements and careful lies. Well, not lies exactly. Omissions. She'd told Elias Whitmore she was educated, capable, and willing. She hadn't mentioned that her father drank himself into an early grave owing money to half of Boston, or that her mother's cough had turned bloody last winter, or that the bank was 3 weeks from seizing their home. She'd written that she was seeking adventure and a fresh start. That part, at least, was accidentally true. The letters had started 6 months ago, when her neighbor Mrs. Holloway showed her the advertisement in the matrimonial news. Respectable rancher seeks educated woman for partnership and companionship. Wyoming territory. Steady income. Established property. Serious inquiries only. Sounds like a cattle baron trying to buy himself a wife, Clara had said, but her hands were already reaching for the newspaper. Mrs. Holloway had pursed her lips in that knowing way of hers. "Sounds like opportunity wearing a different dress. Your mother needs medicine, Clara. The bank needs payment. Pride won't keep you warm when you're living on the street." So Clara had written, a careful, composed letter that made her sound competent instead of desperate. She'd expected silence, or perhaps a response from some leering old man looking for unpaid labor in a kitchen. Instead, she got Elias. His first letter arrived 3 weeks later, written in neat, patient handwriting that suggested education and care. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep or paint Wyoming as anything other than harsh, isolated, and demanding. But he wrote about the land like it mattered, the way the mountains looked at sunrise, the sound of wind through prairie grass, the satisfaction of building something that would last. "I won't lie and say it's easy," he'd written. "The winters are brutal, the work is endless, and Sweetwater Springs isn't Boston. But if you're willing to learn and aren't afraid of calluses, there's a life here worth living. I'm looking for a partner, not a decoration. If that interests you, write back." She had. And over 4 months of careful correspondence, something unexpected happened. She started to trust him. Not love, nothing so foolish as that, but trust. Elias wrote about his ranch hands, his challenges with cattle thieves, his plans for expanding the herd. He asked about her education, her opinions on literature, whether she thought women should have the vote. Of course they should, she'd written back. Taxation without representation was tyranny in 1776. Why should it be different now? His response had been warm with approval. "You'll fit in fine out here. Wyoming women don't wait for permission." The proposal came in his 8th letter, straightforward and honest. "I'm 34 years old, Clara. I own 2,000 acres and run 500 head of cattle. I'm not wealthy, but I'm stable. I can offer you security, respect, and a partnership in building something permanent. If you're willing, I'll send money for travel. We can marry when you arrive, and you'll have full legal claim to everything I own. Whatever happens between us, you won't be left helpless." Clara had read that letter 17 times, looking for the trap. Men didn't offer women legal protection. They didn't promise partnership. They certainly didn't send travel money to strangers who might disappear with it. But Elias did. The bank draft arrived a week later, enough for train fare and supplies, with a note saying he trusted her judgment. That trust, more than anything, sealed her decision. Her mother had wept when Clara told her. Not from sadness, from relief. "You're saving us," she'd whispered, clutching Clara's hands with fingers gone thin and trembling. "I know you don't want this, baby, but you're saving us." Clara had packed her bag and tried not to think about the fact that she was selling herself in everything but name. Girls from good families didn't marry strangers through newspaper advertisements, but girls from good families didn't watch their mothers cough blood into handkerchiefs while debt collectors circled like vultures either. The train rattled westward, carrying her through landscapes that grew increasingly foreign. Pennsylvania's rolling hills gave way to Ohio's flat farmland, then the endless sprawl of Indiana and Illinois. By the time they crossed the Mississippi River, Clara felt like she'd traveled to another country entirely. Kansas City was overwhelming, loud, dirty, crowded with people who moved like they had somewhere important to be. Clara spent 6 hours in the station waiting for her connection, watching men in dusty boots and women in practical calico dresses that looked nothing like the fashions back home. First time west? A woman about Clara's age settled onto the bench beside her, juggling a sleeping infant and a basket of supplies. Clara nodded. Is it that obvious? You're watching everything like it might bite you. The woman smiled, not unkindly. Where are you headed? Wyoming Territory, Sweetwater Springs. The woman's eyebrows rose. That's serious frontier. You got family there? A fiancé? The word felt strange in Clara's mouth. We've been corresponding. Mail order bride, then? It wasn't a question, and there was no judgment in the woman's voice, just recognition. I did the same thing 4 years back. Came out to Kansas to marry a farmer I'd never met. Scared myself half to death on the journey. How did it turn out? The woman looked down at her sleeping baby, and something soft crossed her face. Better than I expected. James wasn't what I'd imagined, but he was decent, honest. We grew into it. She met Clara's eyes. Won't lie to you, it's hard out here. The work breaks you down and the isolation makes you crazy sometimes. But if your man's good and you're willing to bend instead of break, you can build something real. Clara wanted to believe that, desperately. The train to Wyoming was smaller, rougher, filled with miners and ranch hands, and the occasional family heading toward promised land that probably didn't exist. Clara kept to herself, reading and rereading Elias's letters until she had them memorized. The landscape outside her window transformed into something alien and magnificent. The flat prairies gave way to rolling grasslands, then sudden dramatic upthrusts of rock and mountain. The sky grew bigger somehow, stretching from horizon to horizon without buildings or trees to interrupt it. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. She'd expected to feel something when the conductor called out Sweetwater Springs. Relief, maybe. Or anticipation. Instead, she felt numb. The train slowed, brakes screaming against iron rails, and Clara gathered her carpetbag with hands that had gone steady from sheer force of will. The platform was barely a platform, just rough wooden planks beside a tiny station house that looked like a strong wind might knock it over. A handful of people waited in the October cold, breath misting in air that bit with the promise of coming winter. Clara stepped down, boots hitting solid ground after days of train movement, and looked for Elias. She'd studied the photograph he'd sent, a formal portrait showing a man with dark hair, serious eyes, and the kind of face that suggested reliability rather than charm. I'm not handsome, he'd written in the accompanying letter, but I'm honest, and I don't photograph well. You'll have to judge in person. But Elias wasn't there. Instead, a man in a worn duster coat and dusty boots stood near the station house, watching the arriving passengers with an expression that managed to be both alert and tired. He was younger than Elias, late 20s maybe, with sun-weathered skin and dark blonde hair that needed cutting. When his eyes found Clara, something shifted in his posture. Not quite recognition, but awareness. He walked toward her with the loose, economical gait of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. Miss Hale? Clara's chest tightened. Yes, are you? Caleb Mercer. I'm foreman at the Whitmore Ranch. He pulled off his hat, and Clara saw exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes. I'm afraid I've got bad news, Miss Hale. Elias asked me to meet you if anything happened. The platform seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. What do you mean, if anything happened? Caleb's jaw tightened. Maybe we should sit down. I've been sitting for 8 days straight. Just tell me. He looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw him make a decision. Elias is dead, Miss Hale. He was shot during a property dispute 5 days ago. The wound got infected, and we couldn't. He stopped, swallowed hard. He died 2 days before you arrived. I'm sorry. The words landed like physical blows. Clara heard them, understood them on some intellectual level, but they didn't feel real. Elias was dead. The man she'd never met, the man who'd promised her safety and partnership and a fresh start, dead before she even arrived. You're lying. The words came out flat, automatic. I wish I was. Caleb's voice was rough, with something that sounded like genuine grief. Elias was a good man. Best man I ever worked for. He talked about you constantly these last few months, showed everyone your letters, made plans for the house, drove us all half crazy with preparations. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, creased and worn from handling. He wrote this the day before the shooting, asked me to give it to you if something went wrong. He knew the risks, Miss Hale. Knew he was pushing back against the wrong people, but he was stubborn that way. Clara took the envelope with numb fingers. Her name was written across it in Elias's familiar handwriting. The sight of it cracked something inside her chest. What am I supposed to do now? The question came out smaller than she intended, and she hated herself for it. Caleb's expression softened slightly. That's complicated. You've got options, none of them great. There's a boarding house in town if you need a place to stay while you figure things out. Mrs. Patterson's decent enough, won't charge you much, or... He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Or what? Elias left everything to you in his will. The ranch, the land, the cattle, the debts, all of it. Had it drawn up legal 3 weeks ago when he heard you'd agreed to come. Caleb met her eyes steadily. If you want it, it's yours. But I won't lie to you, it's a mess right now. Elias died before he could finalize some important contracts, and there are people who'd rather see the ranch fail than succeed under new ownership, especially under a woman's ownership. Clara's mind spun. She'd come west expecting an arranged marriage and difficult adjustment. Instead, she'd inherited a ranch, debts, and enemies she didn't understand. Can I sell it? Eventually, maybe. Not quickly and not for what it's worth. Elias invested everything in expansion this year. The land's valuable, but most of his capital is tied up in cattle and contracts that haven't paid out yet. Caleb shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. Look, Miss Hale, I know this is overwhelming. You just got off a train from Boston and found out the man you were supposed to marry is dead. You don't have to decide anything right now. Yes, I do. Clara's voice came out stronger than she felt. I can't go back to Massachusetts. I used the return fare to pay my mother's medical bills. So my choices are find work in Sweetwater Springs, marry some other stranger, or figure out how to run a ranch I've never seen. Something like respect flickered across Caleb's face. That's a clear-eyed assessment. I'm good at clear-eyed assessments. It's optimism I struggle with. Clara looked down at the letter in her hands, then back at Caleb. If I try to keep the ranch, what happens? Realistically. Caleb considered her question seriously. Realistically, it'll be hard as hell. The hands are loyal, but they're used to taking orders from someone who knows cattle and land management. You'll have to learn fast, delegate smart, and prove you're not just some city woman playing at ranch ownership. There's a cattle contract that needs negotiating in Cheyenne next month. Miss that deadline, and we lose a year's profit. Winter's coming, which means different challenges. And like I said, there are people who'd prefer to see you fail. Who? Marcus Bellamy runs the Circle B Ranch to the east. He's been trying to buy Elias out for 2 years, made threats when Elias refused to sell. I can't prove he was behind the shooting, but Caleb's expression went hard. Let's say I have suspicions. Clara's hands tightened on her carpet bag. So if I stay, I'm walking into a fight I don't understand against an enemy I can't prove exists. More or less. And if I leave, Bellamy probably buys the land at a fraction of its value. The hands lose their jobs. Elias's work, everything he built, disappears. Caleb's voice was carefully neutral, but Clara heard the weight beneath it. But you'd be free to start over somewhere safer. That's worth considering. Clara closed her eyes, trying to organize her thoughts through the exhaustion and shock. She'd come west to save her mother and escape debt. Running back to Boston wasn't an option. She'd already spent the money she'd need for that journey. Working as a shopgirl or seamstress in Sweetwater Springs might sustain her, but barely, and she'd be alone in a frontier town with no connections and no protection. Or she could stay. Fight for something she'd never seen, learn skills she'd never needed, and try to honor a promise made to a dead man she'd never met. It was insane. Completely insane. She opened Elias's letter with shaking fingers. Dear Clara, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're standing in Sweetwater Springs wondering what the hell you've gotten yourself into. I'm sorry. I never meant to leave you stranded like this, but the situation with Bellamy has escalated, and I'm about to push back hard. Might work out fine. Might not. I've left everything to you because I meant what I said in my letters. I was looking for a partner, not a dependent. You're smart, educated, and brave enough to cross half a continent to start over. That's the kind of person who can build something real out here. You don't owe me anything. If you want to sell and leave, do it without guilt. But if you stay, know this. Caleb Mercer is the best foreman in Wyoming. He's loyal, honest, and competent. Trust him. The ranch hands are good men. The land is worth fighting for. And despite everything, this is a place where a woman can build her own life instead of living one someone else chose for her. Whatever you decide, I hope you find what you came west looking for, even if it doesn't look like what you expected. With respect and regret, Elias Whitmore. Clara read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. When she looked up, Caleb was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was a good writer, Clara said quietly. He was a good man. Caleb cleared his throat. What do you want to do, Miss Hale? Clara looked around the platform, at the rough buildings, the vast sky, the mountains rising in the distance like broken teeth. Everything about this place was foreign and harsh, and nothing like what she'd imagined. I want to see the ranch, she said. Before I decide anything, I want to see what Elias thought was worth dying for. Caleb nodded slowly. It's a 2-hour ride. We should go now if we want to make it before dark. Then let's go. He led her to a wagon hitched behind the station. Rough, practical, nothing like the carriages she was used to. Caleb loaded her carpet bag into the back, then offered his hand to help her up. Clara took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. This was real. All of it. The dead fiancé, the inherited ranch, the impossible decision. Real in a way nothing in her carefully planned Boston life had ever been. The wagon lurched into motion, and Sweetwater Springs fell away behind them. They traveled in silence through landscape that seemed designed to break the human spirit, endless grass punctuated by rock formations that looked like the earth's bones showing through. The sky pressed down from above, huge and unforgiving. You'll want warmer clothes, Caleb said eventually. What you're wearing won't survive a Wyoming winter. Clara looked down at her traveling dress, practical by Boston standards, laughably inadequate out here. I don't have money for warmer clothes. Ranch has an account at the general store. You can draw on it. He kept his eyes on the road. Elias would have wanted you equipped properly, regardless of what you decide. That's generous. That's practical. Can't have you freezing to death before you make up your mind. There might have been the ghost of humor in his voice, but it was hard to tell. How long did you work for Elias? 5 years. Came on as a hand, worked my way up to foreman. And in 5 years, you learned to trust him. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Elias didn't play games, said what he meant, did what he said. That's rare out here. Did he talk about me? Clara hated herself for asking, but she needed to know. Constantly, drove us all half crazy. This time, there was definitely warmth in Caleb's voice. He was excited, Miss Hale. Nervous, but excited. Made plans, fixed up the house, practiced what he'd say when you arrived. His jaw tightened. He wanted this to work. Wanted to build something permanent instead of just surviving season to season. Clara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry. Not yet. Not when she still had decisions to make and no privacy to fall apart in. The landscape shifted gradually as they traveled, the flat grassland giving way to rolling hills, then deeper valleys carved by ancient water. Clara saw her first antelope, watched them bound away from the wagon's approach with impossible grace. Hawks circled overhead, riding thermal currents she couldn't see. There, Caleb said, pointing ahead. That's Whitmore land, all of it, from the creek to those far hills. Clara followed his gesture and felt her breath catch. The ranch spread across a valley flanked by rough hills, with a creek running through it like a silver thread. She could see buildings, a main house, barn, several outbuildings, corrals holding horses and cattle. Smoke rose from a chimney, laundry hung on a line. It looked lived in, real. 2,000 acres, Caleb continued. Good grazing, reliable water, access to timber in the hills. Elias chose well when he filed the claim 8 years ago. The wagon descended into the valley, and details emerged. The house was bigger than Clara expected. 2 stories, solid construction, with a wide porch that suggested someone had thought about comfort, not just shelter. The barn was massive, well-maintained, Fences were straight and strong. "It's beautiful," Clara said, surprising herself. "It's work." But Caleb's voice held pride. Every fence post, every building, every acre cleared, Elias built this from nothing. He was 26 when he came out here, broke and stubborn. Now it's worth something. They pulled into the yard, and immediately men appeared from the barn and bunkhouse, ranch hands stopping their work to see who'd arrived. Clara counted 6 of them, all watching her with expressions ranging from curious to guarded. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, then raised his voice to address the gathered men. "This is Miss Clara Hale. She came from Boston to marry Elias, but she's too late for that. What she's not too late for is inheriting everything he owned. The ranch is hers now, legal and proper. I expect you to treat her with respect and answer her questions honestly. Clear?" There was a murmur of acknowledgement, some nods. Clara saw skepticism on a few faces, resignation on others. These men had just lost their employer and friend. Now they were being told to take orders from a city woman who knew nothing about ranching. "I know this is difficult," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "I know you're grieving Elias, and I know I'm not what you expected. I'm not what I expected either, but I'm here, and I'm trying to understand what happens next." One of the older hands, gray-haired, weather-beaten, stepped forward. "Name's Tom Brennan, miss. Been with Elias since the beginning. We all respect what you're facing, but you need to understand, this ranch doesn't run itself. Winter's coming, we've got cattle to move, contracts to fulfill. We need someone who knows what they're doing." "Tom," Caleb started, but Clara held up a hand. "He's right. I don't know anything about running a ranch. I can't ride, I don't know cattle, and I'd probably get lost between here and the creek." She met Tom's eyes steadily. "But I can learn. I'm educated, I'm not afraid of hard work, and I have nothing to go back to. If I stay, I'll need all of you to teach me. If that's not something you're willing to do, tell me now." Tom studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. You want to learn? We'll teach you. But don't expect miracles, miss. There's a lot to know." "I don't expect miracles. I expect hard work and probably a lot of failures." Clara looked around at the assembled men. "I'll make you a deal. Give me 2 weeks to learn the basics and see if I can handle this. If I can't, I'll sell and you'll get fair severance. If I can, then I stay and we figure out how to make this work together. Sound reasonable?" There was a general murmur of agreement. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was something. Caleb touched her elbow lightly. "Let me show you the house. You'll want to get settled before dark." Clara followed him across the yard, acutely aware of the eyes watching her, judging her. The house's interior was sparse but comfortable. A main room with a fireplace and worn furniture. A kitchen with a cast-iron stove, 2 bedrooms upstairs. Everything was clean but dusty, like someone had tried to maintain it despite recent tragedy. "Elias slept in the main bedroom," Caleb said. "Fixed it up for when you arrived. The smaller rooms got some of his mother's things. She died when he was young, but he kept her furniture." Clara walked into the main bedroom and stopped. Someone had clearly put effort into making this space welcoming. Clean curtains hung at the windows. A quilt covered the bed, handmade, beautiful, probably bought at significant expense from someone in town. A vase sat on the dresser, empty now, but clearly meant for flowers. "He wanted it to be nice for you," Caleb said quietly from the doorway. "Spent 2 weeks getting everything ready." Clara traced her fingers along the quilt, throat tight. "He was a good man." "Yes, he was." She turned to face Caleb, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "I need time to think, to process all of this." "Take what you need. I'll be in the bunkhouse if you have questions." He hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, Miss Hale, I think you can do this. I think Elias knew what he was doing when he left everything to you." "Why? You don't know me." "No. But you crossed half a continent alone to start over. That takes courage. And you didn't fall apart when I told you Elias was dead. You asked practical questions and made a plan. That takes strength." He met her eyes steadily. "This place breaks weak people. You're not weak." He left before Clara could respond, boots heavy on the stairs. She stood alone in the bedroom of a dead man she'd never met, in a house she now owned, in a landscape she didn't understand. Then finally she allowed herself to cry. Clara woke to the sound of roosters and men's voices drifting through the window. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then reality crashed back. Wyoming, the ranch, Elias dead, everything hers and nothing hers simultaneously. She'd fallen asleep in her traveling dress, too exhausted to do more than remove her boots. Now her body ached from the train journey and her eyes felt gritty from crying. The morning light slanting through the curtains was different from Boston light, sharper somehow, unfiltered by ocean fog or city smoke. Someone had left a pitcher of water and a basin on the dresser. Clara splashed her face, trying to wash away the evidence of her breakdown. Her reflection in the small mirror looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, hair escaping its pins, nothing like the composed young woman who'd boarded a train in Massachusetts 8 days ago. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Hale?" Caleb's voice, careful and formal. "Breakfast is ready if you want it. No obligation." Clara's stomach clenched with hunger she'd been ignoring. "I'll be down in a moment." She did what she could with her appearance, repinned her hair, smoothed her dress, tried to look like someone capable of making life-altering decisions. It didn't work, but it would have to do. The kitchen smelled like coffee and bacon, scents so normal they felt surreal. Caleb stood by the stove, cooking with the efficient movements of someone who'd spent years fending for himself. He glanced up when she entered, then returned his attention to the pan. "Coffee's hot. Cups are in the cabinet above the sink." Clara poured herself a cup, grateful for something to do with her hands. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, nothing like the refined breakfast blends her mother served in delicate china cups. She took a sip and nearly choked. "Too strong?" Caleb asked without looking up. "It's fine." Her voice came out hoarse. "Just different. Everything's different out here." He slid eggs and bacon onto 2 plates, set one in front of her at the small kitchen table. "Eat. You look like you're about to fall over." Clara wanted to argue but couldn't. She was starving. The food disappeared faster than was probably ladylike, but Caleb didn't comment. He ate his own breakfast in silence, giving her space to think. "I need to understand what I'm dealing with," Clara said finally, setting down her fork. "You mentioned contracts and debts and enemies. I need details, not generalities." Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her. "All right, the basics first. The ranch runs about 500 head of cattle right now. We've got contracts to deliver 200 head to Cheyenne in 6 weeks. That's our main income for the year. Elias negotiated a good price, but the buyer's particular about timing. Miss the deadline, we lose the contract and the money." "How much money?" "Enough to cover winter expenses, pay the hands, and have surplus for spring expansion. Without it, we'd have to sell off cattle at whatever price we can get locally, which won't be enough." He paused. "We'd survive the winter, but barely. And Bellamy would have leverage to make offers." Clara absorbed this. "What else?" "Land payments. Elias owned half the ranch outright, but he took a loan to buy the eastern section 2 years ago. Payments are manageable as long as the cattle sales go through. If they don't, the bank could foreclose on that section." "How much is owed?" Caleb named a figure that made Clara's chest tighten. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't comfortable either. "And Bellamy wants this land why?" "Water access. The creek runs through our property and his. Right now he's got access through an easement Elias granted, but if we sell to someone else, that could change. Bellamy wants to control the water completely, and he's not patient about it." "You think he had Elias killed?" "I think Elias was shot during an argument about property boundaries, and I think the timing was convenient for Bellamy." Caleb's voice went flat. "Can't prove it. The shooter was some drifter nobody'd seen before, and he disappeared before the sheriff could question him properly. Might have been random, might not." Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, trying to process the layers of complication. "If I stay, Bellamy will come after me too." "Probably, though he might underestimate you because you're a woman. Could work in your favor initially. Until it doesn't." "Until it doesn't," Caleb agreed. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Clara could hear the ranch waking up. Horses whinnying, men calling to each other, the rhythm of a place that functioned whether or not she understood how. "I want to see the cattle," she said abruptly, "and I want to learn to ride. Today." Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's ambitious. I don't have time for careful learning curves. If I'm going to do this, I need to understand what I'm managing." She met his eyes steadily. "Can you teach me?" "I can teach you not to fall off a horse. Anything beyond that takes practice." He stood, collecting their plates. "Wear the most practical clothes you have. We'll start after I check in with the hands." An hour later, Clara stood in the corral wearing her plainest dress and sturdiest boots. watching Caleb approach with a horse that looked far too large and far too aware of her incompetence. "This is Sage," Caleb said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's steady, patient, and smarter than most people. If you're going to learn on any horse, it should be her." Clara eyed Sage with deep suspicion. The horse eyed her back with what seemed like equal skepticism. "First rule," Caleb continued, "horses sense fear. They're prey animals. If you're nervous, they get nervous. So breathe, relax your shoulders, and approach like you belong here." "I don't belong here." "Then pretend better." There might have been humor in his voice, but his face remained serious. "Come stand beside her. Let her get used to you." Clara approached slowly, keeping her movements careful. Sage's dark eye tracked her, large and liquid and unreadable. When Clara was close enough, Caleb guided her hand to the horse's shoulder. "Feel that?" he said quietly. "That's muscle and warmth, and a living creature who'll carry you if you treat her right. Horses aren't machines. They have moods, preferences, bad days. You need to work with them, not against them." The horse's coat was softer than Clara expected, warm beneath her palm. She could feel Sage breathing, the rise and fall of powerful ribs. Something in her chest loosened slightly. "Good," Caleb said. "Now I'm going to show you how to mount. Watch first." He demonstrated with easy grace, foot in stirrup, hand on the saddle, smooth swing up and over. He made it look effortless. Clara suspected it wouldn't be. "Your turn." It took 3 attempts, and Caleb's steadying hand on her back before Clara managed to haul herself into the saddle. She sat there, gripping the horn, trying not to think about how far away the ground suddenly seemed. "Relax," Caleb said from below. "You're stiff as a board. The horse moves, you move with her. Fighting the motion just makes you sore and unstable." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one about to die." "You're not going to die. Worst case, you fall off, and I help you back on." He adjusted her feet in the stirrups, correcting her posture with impersonal efficiency. Heels down, back straight, hands light on the reins. Sage knows what to do. You just need to not interfere too much. They spent the next hour in the corral with Caleb leading Sage in slow circles while Clara tried to find her balance. It was harder than it looked. Her thighs screamed, her back ached, and she was pretty sure she'd have bruises in places she didn't want to think about. But gradually, incrementally, she started to feel the rhythm Caleb had mentioned, the way Sage moved beneath her, the subtle shifts of weight that kept her centered. "Better," Caleb said after she'd completed a full circuit without looking like she might topple off. "You're a fast learner, or sufficiently terrified of failure. That works too." He stopped Sage and looked up at Clara. "Want to try alone?" No, she absolutely did not want to try alone, but she nodded anyway. Caleb stepped back, giving her the reins completely. "Just walk her around the corral. Gentle pressure to turn, light touch to stop. She'll do most of the work." Clara took a breath and squeezed her legs slightly the way Caleb had shown her. Sage started forward, and Clara's heart leaped into her throat. But the mare moved smoothly, responding to Clara's tentative guidance without judgment or resistance. They made one full circuit, then another. By the third, Clara felt something unexpected. Not confidence exactly, but the beginning of understanding. "That'll do for today," Caleb called. "Any more, and you won't be able to walk tomorrow." He was probably right. Clara's legs were already trembling from effort as he helped her dismount. She hit the ground harder than intended, stumbled, and Caleb caught her elbow to steady her. "Easy. First day's always rough. How long before I can actually ride? Not just sit there while the horse tolerates me." "Depends how much you practice. A few weeks maybe, if you're serious about it." He studied her face. "You are serious. I can't run a ranch if I can't ride across it." Clara straightened despite her protesting muscles. "What else do I need to learn today?" Caleb looked like he might argue, then seemed to reconsider. "Come on, I'll show you the rest of the operation." They spent the afternoon touring the ranch, and with each passing hour, Clara's understanding of what Elias had built deepened. The barn held equipment she didn't recognize, supplies carefully organized, tools maintained with obvious care. The bunkhouse where the hands lived was rough but clean, evidence of men who took pride in their space despite its simplicity. Tom Brennan joined them partway through, adding commentary that was both educational and testing. He'd quiz Clara on details, watching to see if she retained information or just nodded along politely. "See those cattle in the far pasture?" Tom pointed toward distant shapes. "Those are the ones we're driving to Cheyenne. Mixed herd, steers mostly, few breeding cows. They need to put on weight before the drive, which means moving them to better grazing next week. How do you move that many cattle? Clara asked. Carefully. Tom's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Takes the whole crew, good horses, and patience. They spook easy, especially if they're not used to being driven. One wrong move and you've got 500 head scattering across the territory. Clara tried to imagine that chaos. Failed completely. They walked to the creek next, and Clara understood immediately why Bellamy wanted control of the water. It ran clear and steady, fed by mountain runoff, reliable even in dry seasons. The land on both sides was rich grazing, the kind of resource that made the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Elias fought hard for this section, Caleb said quietly. Bellamy tried to file claim first, but Elias beat him to the land office. Been bad blood ever since. How bad? Cut fences, poisoned water troughs, cattle driven off in the night. Nothing we could prove, but everyone knew. Caleb's jaw tightened. Elias tried to negotiate, offered fair water rights, even proposed splitting maintenance costs. Bellamy wasn't interested in fair, he wanted it all. Clara looked across the creek toward a land that presumably belonged to Bellamy. Has he made contact since Elias died? Not yet, but he will. Tom spoke up from behind them. Man like that, he'll wait a respectful interval, then come with an offer. Probably try to convince you that selling is the smart choice for a woman alone. I'm not alone. I have all of you. Tom and Caleb exchanged a look Clara couldn't quite read. About that, Tom said carefully, the men need to know your intentions, Miss Hale. Are you staying or selling? Because if you're selling, some of them will want to look for other work before winter sets in. It was a fair question. Clara had promised them 2 weeks to decide, but she realized suddenly that she'd already made her choice. Maybe she'd made it standing on the platform in Sweetwater Springs, or reading Elias's letter, or this morning when she'd demanded to learn to ride. The when didn't matter. The decision was made. I'm staying, she said. The words came out steady, certain. I'm keeping the ranch, making the Cheyenne delivery, and learning everything I need to know to make this work. If any of the hands want to leave, I understand, but I'm not selling to Bellamy or anyone else. Tom studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll tell the men. They'll appreciate knowing where they stand. He walked away, leaving Clara and Caleb alone by the creek. The afternoon sun slanted across the water, turning it gold. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out. You're sure about this? Caleb asked quietly. No, I'm terrified and completely out of my depth. Clara watched the water flow past, constant and unbothered by human complications. But going back to Boston means watching my mother die slowly, while we lose everything anyway. At least here, I have a chance to build something. Even if I fail, at least I'll fail trying. You won't fail. Caleb's voice held quiet conviction. You're stubborn enough to make this work. Is that a compliment? Out here? Absolutely. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Caleb spoke again. We should head back. You need food and rest, and I need to brief the crew about tomorrow's work. The walk back to the house felt longer than the walk out, Clara's muscles reminding her of every minute she'd spent in the saddle. By the time they reached the yard, she was limping slightly, trying not to show it. Caleb noticed anyway. There's liniment in the barn. Rub it on your legs and back before bed, or you'll regret it tomorrow. Speaking from experience? Everyone's first day riding ends the same way. No shame in it. He paused at the porch steps. I'll have one of the hands bring you supplies from town tomorrow. Winter clothes, proper boots, things you'll need. Make a list if there's anything specific. Clara nodded, too tired to argue about accepting help. Caleb headed toward the bunkhouse, and she climbed the porch steps feeling every one of her 22 years. Inside, the house felt different than it had that morning. Less like a museum to someone else's life, more like a space she might actually inhabit. She found Elias's personal effects in the bedroom. Clothing, letters, a journal he'd kept sporadically. Part of her felt like an intruder going through a dead man's possessions. The rest of her knew she needed to understand who he'd been. The journal entries were sparse but revealing. Elias wrote about the ranch with genuine affection, detailed his business decisions, noted the changing seasons. But scattered throughout were entries about Clara, his hopes, his nervousness, his plans for their future together. Received another letter from Clara today, one entry read. She asked intelligent questions about ranch management and didn't romanticize the difficulties. I think we might actually build something real together. For the first time in years, I'm not just surviving, I'm looking forward. Clara closed the journal, chest tight. She'd never know what they might have built together. That future had died with Elias 2 days before her train arrived. But maybe she could honor his memory by building something anyway, even if it looked different than either of them had imagined. She found the liniment in the barn where Caleb said it would be and applied it to her protesting muscles with gritted teeth. The smell was medicinal and sharp, but the warmth that followed eased some of the ache. Night fell quickly in Wyoming, she was learning. One moment the sun was setting, the next darkness pressed against the windows like a physical thing. Clara lit lamps throughout the house, pushing back the shadows, then made herself a simple dinner from supplies in the kitchen. She was washing her plate when another knock came at the door. Caleb again holding a stack of books. "Thought you might want these," he said. Ranch management guides, cattle breeding information, ledgers from the last 5 years. If you're serious about learning, might as well start with the business side. Clara took the books, surprised by their weight. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The ledgers are dense and Elias's handwriting gets worse when he's tired." Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. "Look, Miss Hale, I know I've been throwing a lot at you. If you need time to process, or if you want to change your mind, I don't want to change my mind." Clara cut him off firmly. "I'm overwhelmed and scared and completely ignorant about ranching, but I meant what I said. I'm staying." Caleb nodded slowly. "Then we'll make it work." He turned to leave, then paused. "You did good today. The writing, the questions, the decision." Elias would have been proud. He left before Clara could respond, disappearing into the darkness beyond the porch. She closed the door and looked down at the books in her arms. The top one was titled Practical Cattle Management for the Western Territories. The ledgers beneath it represented 5 years of Elias's careful record-keeping. This was her life now, learning, adapting, surviving, building something from the ruins of someone else's dream. Clara carried the books upstairs and spread them across the bed. Then she began to read. She worked until her eyes burned and the lamp oil ran low, absorbing information about cattle breeds, grazing rotation, market prices, winter feed requirements. The ledgers told the story of the ranch's growth, lean early years when Elias barely broke even, gradual expansion, careful investments that paid off slowly. He'd been methodical, patient, willing to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term stability. The last entry in the current ledger was dated 3 days before his death. Contract confirmed with Morrison Cattle Company, Cheyenne. 200 head at $45 per head. Delivery November 20th. This will set us up for spring expansion and Clara's arrival. Everything is finally coming together. Clara traced the words with one finger, throat tight. Everything had been coming together, and then it had all fallen apart in the space of a gunshot and an infected wound. But she was here now. She couldn't bring Elias back or fulfill the life he'd planned, but she could keep the ranch alive. She could honor what he'd built by refusing to let it die. She fell asleep with the ledgers spread around her, numbers and projections filling her dreams. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of relentless learning. Clara rode every morning until her body adapted to the motion, until Sage responded to her commands without hesitation. She studied the ledgers until she could recite profit margins and expense ratios. She followed Tom and the other hands around the ranch, asking questions until they stopped looking at her like she was a temporary inconvenience and started answering like she might actually stay. Caleb was there through all of it, teaching, correcting, pushing her harder than was probably kind, but exactly as hard as she needed. He showed her how to read cattle health, how to spot good grazing versus depleted land, how to calculate what winter feed would cost based on herd size and weather predictions. "You're not going to learn this all at once," he told her one afternoon when she was frustrated by her own ignorance. "Elias spent 8 years building his knowledge. You've got weeks. Focus on what matters now, the Cheyenne delivery, winter preparations, keeping the crew working smoothly." "And Bellamy?" "Bellamy can wait." But Caleb's expression suggested Bellamy wouldn't wait long. He was right. On the 15th day after Clara's arrival, Marcus Bellamy came calling. Clara was in the barn checking feed supplies when Tom found her. "Rider coming in? Looks like Bellamy." Her stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Where's Caleb?" "North pasture. Want me to send for him?" Clara considered, then shook her head. No, I'm the owner. I'll handle this. She walked out to the yard, wiping dust from her hands on the canvas work pants she'd taken to wearing, despite their complete lack of femininity. A man on a fine black horse was approaching. Older than she expected, maybe 50, with silver threading through dark hair and clothes that spoke of money. He dismounted with practiced ease and removed his hat when he saw her. Miss Hale, I presume. Marcus Bellamy. I own the Circle B ranch to the east. Mr. Bellamy. Clara kept her voice neutral. What can I do for you? I wanted to pay my respects and offer my condolences about Elias. He was a good man, if misguided about certain business matters. Bellamy's smile didn't reach his eyes. I also wanted to make you an offer. How generous. If Bellamy caught her sarcasm, he ignored it. I understand you're in a difficult position. Stranger in an unfamiliar place trying to manage property you don't understand. That's not a criticism. It's simply reality. I'd like to make things easier for you by buying the ranch. At a fair price, more than fair, actually, considering the complications. He named a figure that was probably half what the land was worth. You could return to Boston comfortable, start fresh without the burden of trying to run a cattle operation. Clara met his eyes steadily. That's very thoughtful, but I'm not selling. Bellamy's expression hardened slightly. Miss Hale, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. Clara cut him off. You want the water access. You've wanted it for years. Elias wouldn't sell, and neither will I. Elias is dead. Yes. And he left everything to me, legal and binding. The ranch is mine, Mr. Bellamy. It's not for sale at any price. They stared at each other across the yard. Bellamy's mask of friendly concern was cracking, revealing something colder beneath. You're making a mistake, he said finally. This ranch will eat you alive. You'll lose everything trying to hold on to land you can't manage. Maybe. But it'll be my mistake to make. Clara kept her voice level despite her racing heart. Was there anything else? Bellamy's jaw tightened. When you fail, and you will fail, don't expect me to offer again. The next buyer won't be as generous. He mounted his horse and rode off without another word, leaving Clara standing in the yard with her heart pounding and her hands shaking slightly. She didn't move until Caleb appeared from the barn, where he'd apparently been listening the entire time. That went well, he said dryly. He threatened me. Of course he did. You just refused the easy solution to his problem. Caleb studied her face. You handled it right, though. Didn't show weakness, didn't negotiate. He'll respect that, even if he doesn't like it. Will he come after me the way he went after Elias? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Probably. But now he knows you're not running scared. That changes the game. He paused. You should know, some of the hands heard that conversation. Word will spread. By tomorrow, everyone in the territory will know you stood up to Bellamy. Is that good or bad? Depends who you ask. But it means you're committed now. No going back. Caleb's expression was unreadable. Still sure about this? Clara thought about Boston, her mother's cough, the debt collectors. She thought about Elias's letters and his journal entries and the life he'd tried to build. She thought about the past 2 weeks, the aching muscles, the endless learning, the slow understanding of how this harsh land worked. I'm sure, she said. Let Bellamy come. We'll be ready. The cattle drive to Cheyenne was scheduled for early November, which gave Clara 3 weeks to prepare for something she'd never witnessed, let alone participated in. Caleb made it clear she didn't need to come. The hands could manage the delivery without her, but Clara refused to stay behind. If I'm the owner, I need to understand every part of the operation, she said one morning while helping Tom sort equipment in the barn, including the parts that scare me. Everything should scare you about a cattle drive, Tom replied, not looking up from the coils of rope he was inspecting. 200 head moving across rough country for 5 days. Weather can turn on you, cattle can spook, rivers can flood. It's dangerous work even for experienced hands. Then I'll learn from experienced hands. Clara picked up a saddle that needed repairs, examining the worn leather. Unless you think I'm incapable, Tom finally looked at her, weathered face thoughtful. Didn't say that. You've surprised me these past weeks, Miss Hale. Most city folk would have run back east by now, but surviving ranch work and surviving a cattle drive are different animals. I'm aware. Clara met his gaze steadily. I'm still going. Tom shook his head but didn't argue further. Word spread through the crew that Clara would be riding with them to Cheyenne, and she caught the mixture of skepticism and grudging respect in their expressions. They'd watched her spend 3 weeks learning to ride properly, studying the business ledgers until late every night, asking questions that proved she was actually listening to their answers. She wasn't one of them yet, might never be, but she wasn't dead weight either. Caleb was less diplomatic about his concerns. "You'll slow us down," he said bluntly during their evening review of the route. They were in the main house, maps spread across the kitchen table, lamplight throwing shadows across the carefully marked trail. "The hands can push harder without worrying about whether you're keeping up." "Then I'll keep up." Clara traced the route with one finger, memorizing landmarks and river crossings. "How long each day?" 10 to 12 hours in the saddle, depending on terrain and how the cattle move. "We'll camp rough, rotate watch shifts through the night." "It's not comfortable, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name instead of Miss Hale, and something about the informality made the warning feel more real. She looked up from the maps to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I don't need comfort. I need to prove I can do this." She kept her voice level. "Not just to the crew or to you. To myself. If I stay behind while you deliver the herd, I'm just someone who inherited property. If I ride with you, I'm someone who works for what she owns." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "You know, you don't have to prove anything. The ranch is legally yours regardless." "Legal ownership and earned respect are different things." Clara straightened, meeting his eyes. "You know that better than anyone." He nodded slowly, conceding the point. "Fine, but you follow orders without question, you don't take risks, and if I tell you to stay back from a situation, you stay back. Clear?" "Clear. And you're taking Sage. She's steady enough to handle the chaos." Caleb started rolling up the maps, movements precise. "We leave November 3rd at dawn. Pack light, bedroll, spare clothes, personal items. Everything else gets loaded on the supply wagon." The days leading up to departure passed in a blur of final preparations. Clara practiced riding for longer stretches, building endurance her body still complained about. She helped the crew sort and brand the cattle designated for sale, learning to read the animals' moods and movements. Some were calm, others skittish. All of them were larger and more intimidating up close than she'd expected. "Don't show fear," one of the younger hands told her during branding. His name was Jesse, barely 20, with sun-bleached hair and an easy grin. "They can sense it same as horses. Act like you belong, and they'll mostly leave you alone." "Mostly," Clara repeated dryly. "Well, some of them are just mean, but that's true of people too." Jesse grinned at her. "You're doing all right, Miss Hale. Better than the last city fellow who came out here looking to learn ranching. He lasted 3 days before deciding Boston sounded real good." Clara found herself smiling despite her nerves. "What happened to him?" "Steer stepped on his foot, his horse threw him into a water trough, and he got saddle sores so bad he couldn't sit down. Pride got injured worse than anything else, I think." Jesse shrugged. "Ranch life isn't for everyone." "Is it for me?" Jesse considered the question seriously. "You're still here, aren't you? That counts for something." The night before they were set to leave, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in Elias's bed, her bed now, though it still felt like borrowing, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about everything that could go wrong. The crew was counting on this delivery. The ranch's survival depended on it, and she was about to ride out on a cattle drive with barely a month's experience on horseback. Somewhere around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs. She was surprised to find lamplight coming from the kitchen and Caleb sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and what looked like supply lists. He glanced up when she entered. "Can't sleep?" "Is it that obvious?" "You're not the only one." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Coffee's still hot if you want it." Clara poured herself a cup and sat down, grateful for the company even if neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence was comfortable, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said eventually. "Sure." "Why are you doing this? You could have left after Elias died, found work at another ranch. Instead, you're helping a complete stranger try to run a place she has no business owning." Caleb stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering. "Elias gave me a chance when nobody else would. I came here 5 years ago running from things I'm not proud of. War changes people, and not always for the better. I was drifting, angry, couldn't hold a job because I couldn't hold my temper." He paused, jaw tight with old memories. Elias hired me anyway, put me to work, gave me structure, didn't ask questions about what I'd done or where I'd been. When I screwed up, and I did plenty of times those first months, he didn't fire me, just told me to do better tomorrow. Caleb looked up, meeting her eyes. He saw something worth salvaging when everyone else saw a problem to avoid. So when he died and left everything to you, walking away felt like betraying that. You're trying to honor what he built. Seemed only right that I help you do it. Clara absorbed this, understanding him better. You loved him, not romantically, but like a brother. Like the family I don't have anymore. Caleb's voice was rough. He was a good man, Clara. Better than most. And he believed you could do this, even though he never met you. That belief means something. What if he was wrong? What if I fail? Then you fail trying, which is more than most people can say. Caleb drained his coffee cup. But I don't think you will. You're stubborn as hell, you learn fast, and you're not afraid to look stupid while you're figuring things out. Those are the qualities that matter out here. Clara wanted to believe him. I'm terrified of tomorrow. Good. Fear keeps you careful. It's overconfidence that gets people killed. He stood, collecting his lists. Get some sleep if you can. We're riding out at first light, and the first day's always the hardest. He left her alone in the kitchen with her coffee and her thoughts. Clara sat there until the lamp oil burned low, then finally headed back upstairs. She still didn't sleep well, but knowing Caleb was just as nervous somehow made it easier to bear. Dawn came cold and gray, with frost coating the grass and breath misting in the air. The crew was already moving when Clara emerged from the house, checking equipment and saddling horses with the efficient movements of long practice. Sage was ready, Tom having prepared her earlier. Clara approached the mare, running a hand along her neck in greeting. Morning, girl. Ready for an adventure? Sage's ear flicked back, listening, unbothered by the chaos of preparation around them. Clara took comfort in the horse's steadiness as she checked the saddle and secured her bedroll behind it. Everyone mounted up, Caleb called from across the yard. We're moving out. The cattle were already gathered in the north pasture, 200 head milling restlessly. The crew spread out around them, and Clara positioned herself where Tom had instructed, on the flank, far enough from the main herd that she wouldn't cause problems, but close enough to help if needed. Just keep them moving in the right direction, Tom had told her during training. Don't try to be a hero. If something goes wrong, get out of the way and let the experienced hands handle it. Clara had nodded, accepting the limitations of her role. She wasn't here to prove she could do everything, just that she was willing to try. The drive started rough. Getting 200 cattle moving in the same direction was like trying to organize chaos with shouting and rope work. Some broke away from the group and had to be chased back. Others refused to move at all until the cowboys literally drove them forward. It was loud, dusty, and completely overwhelming, but gradually, slowly, the herd found its rhythm. They moved northeast toward the Cheyenne Road, following paths worn by previous drives. Clara focused on her section, watching for strays, learning to anticipate which direction the cattle would move before they moved. Sage seemed to understand the work instinctively, responding to the herd's movements in ways Clara was still trying to comprehend. By midday, Clara's back ached. Her throat was raw from dust, and she'd lost count of how many times she'd nearly fallen off when Sage made sudden movements she hadn't anticipated. But the herd was moving, and she was keeping up, barely. They stopped briefly for a cold lunch, jerky and hard biscuits eaten in the saddle because dismounting meant losing time. Jesse rode over to check on her, grinning despite the dust coating his face. How you holding up? I haven't died yet. That's something. Clara's voice came out hoarse. First day's the worst. Your body'll adapt. He gestured toward the herd. You're doing good, though. Keeping your position, not spooking the cattle. Some folks freeze up their first drive. Clara appreciated the encouragement, even if she suspected Jesse was being generous. They moved out again after 20 minutes, and the afternoon blurred into more dust, more cattle, more endless hours of trying to stay upright, while her body screamed for rest. The sun was setting when Caleb finally called for camp. They'd covered maybe 12 miles, which sounded pathetic until Clara remembered they were moving 200 cattle across rough terrain. The crew worked together to establish a perimeter, build fires, prepare a meal that was only marginally more substantial than lunch. Clara slid off Sage and nearly collapsed when her legs hit the ground. Everything hurt. Muscles she didn't know existed were making their complaints known. Easy. Tom appeared beside her, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. First day hits everyone hard. Walk it off if you can, otherwise you'll seize up completely. Clara forced herself to move, taking care of Sage before seeing to her own needs. The mare had worked hard all day and deserved proper attention. By the time she'd brushed down the horse and made sure she had water and feed, full darkness had fallen. The camp was a collection of bedrolls around 2 fires, men eating and talking in low voices. Clara collected her portion of beans and salt pork, found a spot near one of the fires, and sat down with a groan she couldn't quite suppress. "You made it," Caleb said, settling beside her with his own plate. "Wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I." Clara forced herself to eat despite her exhaustion. How many more days of this? 4, maybe 5, depending on weather and how the cattle move. He studied her face in the firelight. "You can still turn back. Send you back to the ranch with one of the hands if you want." "I don't want." Clara met his gaze. "I said I was doing this, and I meant it." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "Stubborn." "So you keep telling me." They ate in silence for a while, surrounded by the sounds of the crew settling in for the night. Someone was playing a harmonica softly, the melody lonely and somehow fitting for the vast darkness pressing in around them. "We'll need to set watch rotations," Caleb said eventually. "Cattle can spook at night, especially this early in the drive when they're not used to the routine. You're excused from watch duty." "Why?" "Because you're barely staying upright as it is, and we need you functional tomorrow." His tone left no room for argument. "Get some sleep, Clara. You've earned it." She wanted to protest, to insist she could pull her weight on watch rotation like everyone else. But exhaustion won out over pride. She finished her food, found her bedroll, and was asleep within minutes of lying down. The second day was somehow worse than the first. Clara's body had stiffened overnight, and mounting Sage required help from Jessie, who had the grace not to comment on her struggles. But once they were moving again, the rhythm came slightly easier. She was learning to read the cattle better, to anticipate trouble before it fully developed. Around noon, dark clouds started building to the west. Caleb rode along the line, checking in with each person. "Storm coming," he said when he reached Clara. "Could be rain, could be snow this time of year. Either way, it'll make the cattle nervous. Stay alert." The storm hit 2 hours later with sudden violence. Rain turned to sleet, driving horizontal across the prairie with wind that made seeing difficult and staying warm impossible. The cattle immediately got restless, pushing against each other, threatening to scatter. "Hold the line!" Caleb's voice cut through the wind. "Don't let them break." Clara clung to her position, trusting Sage to handle the conditions better than she could. The sleet stung her face, soaked through her coat, turned her hands numb on the reins. Around her, the crew worked to keep the herd together, shouting to each other over the wind. A steer broke away from the main group, running blind into the storm. Without thinking, Clara urged Sage after it, determined to prove she could handle problems instead of always needing rescue. It was a mistake. The ground was slick, visibility was near zero, and she had no idea what she was doing. Sage pursued the steer gamely, but when the animal suddenly changed direction, Clara wasn't ready. She lost her balance, felt herself sliding, and hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. She lay there stunned, rain pelting her face, trying to remember how to breathe. Sage stood nearby, reins trailing, waiting patiently. The runaway steer was nowhere to be seen. "What the hell were you thinking?" Caleb appeared out of the storm, dismounting before his horse fully stopped. He hauled Clara to her feet with hands that were not gentle. "I told you not to take risks. The steer is one animal out of 200, not worth you breaking your neck." His face was furious in the dim stormlight. "You could have been trampled, or lost, or worse. You don't know this country, Clara. You don't know how fast things can go wrong. I was trying to help." She pulled free from his grip, anger rising to match his. "I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting. I'm the owner of this operation. Then act like it. The owner makes smart decisions, not reckless ones." Caleb's voice was rough with something beyond anger, fear maybe. "You want to earn respect? Fine. But getting yourself killed doesn't prove anything except that I was wrong to let you come." They stared at each other through the sleet, both breathing hard. Clara wanted to argue, to defend her decision, but deep down she knew he was right. She'd acted on impulse instead of judgment, exactly what he'd warned against. "You're right," she said finally, the words bitter but honest. "I'm sorry." Caleb's expression shifted, the anger draining away to leave exhaustion behind. "Can you ride?" Clara took inventory of her aching body. Nothing felt broken, just bruised and battered. "Yes." "Then get back on your horse and return to position. We'll talk about this later." They rode back to the herd in silence. Clara resumed her place on the flank, chastened and hurting and acutely aware of the eyes watching her. Word of her mistake would spread through the crew, undermining whatever respect she'd managed to earn. The storm passed after another hour, leaving everyone soaked and miserable. They made camp early, needing to dry out and warm up before hypothermia became a problem. Clara helped where she could, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. That night, after the crew had eaten and settled around the fires, Tom found her sitting apart from the group. "Mind if I sit?" Clara shrugged, not trusting her voice. Tom settled down with a grunt, old joints protesting. "Caleb's cooled off, if you're wondering. He gets sharp when he's scared, and you scared him today." "I wasn't trying to." "I know. You were trying to prove yourself. I get it." Tom stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. "But out here, proving yourself means staying alive and learning from mistakes. Doesn't mean never making them. We all do. Means recognizing when you've screwed up and adjusting accordingly." Clara absorbed this. "I could have gotten someone hurt trying to rescue me. But you didn't. And now you know better for next time." He stood, brushing off his pants. "Don't beat yourself up too much, Miss Hale. Caleb was right to be angry, but you're still doing better than most would in your position. Just remember, courage and stupidity sometimes look the same in the moment. The trick is learning to tell them apart." He left her with that thought, returning to the main fire. Clara sat alone for a while longer, replaying the day's events, acknowledging the truth in both Caleb's anger and Tom's measured advice. Eventually she sought out her bedroll, but sleep was elusive despite her exhaustion. She kept seeing the moment she'd lost her balance, felt the ground rushing up, remembered the fear in Caleb's voice when he'd found her. The third day dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on every surface. Clara's body protested even more than the previous mornings, bruises from her fall making themselves known. She forced herself through the routine, caring for Sage, choking down breakfast, mounting up when Caleb gave the signal to move out. He didn't speak to her directly, routing all instructions through Tom or Jesse. Clara accepted the silent treatment as deserved punishment and focused on doing her job without incident. By afternoon, they reached the Laramie River crossing. The water was high from recent rains, moving fast and cold. Clara watched the experienced hands guide the first cattle across, understanding immediately why this was dangerous. The current was strong enough to knock animals off their feet. Footing was uncertain, and once in the water, turning back wasn't an option. "Stay on this side until the herd's mostly across," Tom instructed her. "Then Jesse will help you cross. Don't try it alone." Clara nodded, grateful not to be sent across immediately. She watched and learned, seeing how the cowboys positioned themselves to guide without forcing, how they kept the cattle moving without panicking them. The crossing took 2 hours. When it was finally her turn, Jesse rode alongside her into the water. The cold was shocking, rising quickly from Sage's hooves to Clara's boots to her knees. The current pulled at them, strong and relentless. Sage handled it better than Clara did, steady and sure-footed even when the water reached her chest. Halfway across, Clara understood why Caleb had been so angry about her reckless behavior during the storm. Out here, small mistakes had outsized consequences. The river could kill just as easily as a panicked steer or a fall from a horse. There was no margin for error, no room for pride or stubbornness. They made it across, both soaked and shivering. The crew built large fires on the far bank, trying to dry equipment and warm bodies before moving on. Clara stood as close to the flames as she dared, teeth chattering, thinking about all the ways this journey could go wrong. Caleb appeared beside her, wordlessly handing her a cup of coffee that was probably more valuable than gold in their current situation. She took it, grateful for the warmth. "Thank you." He nodded, still not quite meeting her eyes. "You did good at the crossing, followed instructions, didn't panic." It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Clara would take it. "I'm sorry about yesterday. You were right. I was reckless." "You were brave," Caleb corrected, finally looking at her. "Just pointed in the wrong direction. There's a difference between taking necessary risks and creating unnecessary ones. You'll learn it." How long did it take you to learn? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Still working on it. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. You're doing better than I expected, Clara. Better than I think you realize. Just stay alive long enough to see it through, all right? I'll try. They stood together by the fire, not talking, just existing in the same space while their clothes dried and their bodies slowly stopped shaking from cold. Around them, the crew prepared to move out again. But for just those few minutes, Clara felt something shift between her and Caleb. Not quite friendship. They were too different for that. Their positions too complicated. But understanding, maybe. Mutual respect born from shared hardship. The fourth day brought them within striking distance of Cheyenne. They made good time, the cattle settling into the rhythm of the drive, the crew working together with practiced efficiency. Clara found her role and stayed in it, no longer trying to prove anything except that she could be reliable. That night around the fire, the mood was lighter. They'd be in Cheyenne by noon tomorrow, the delivery would be complete, and everyone could look forward to payment and a real bed. First thing I'm doing is getting a hot bath, Jessie announced, then a steak dinner, then sleeping for about 16 hours straight. I'm buying new boots, another hand said. These ones wore through during the crossing. They went around the circle, each person naming their plans. When it came to Clara, she realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. I'm looking forward to not being in the saddle, she said, which got laughs from the crew. Fair enough, Tom said. What about you, Caleb? Caleb stared into the fire, expression distant. I'm looking forward to getting back to the ranch and starting winter preparations. Season waits for no one. It was such a Caleb answer, practical, forward-thinking, focused on work instead of reward. Clara found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. The last morning came with clear skies and cautious optimism. They broke camp before dawn, moving the herd toward Cheyenne with renewed purpose. The city appeared on the horizon around mid-morning, small by Boston standards, but substantial for Wyoming territory. Buildings, streets, the organized chaos of commerce and civilization. The Morrison Cattle Company yards were on the outskirts. Claire watched as Caleb negotiated with the buyer, papers changing hands, the herd counted and inspected. Everything Elias had planned was coming together, just without Elias here to see it. When the buyer handed it over the payment, a bank draft representing months of work, and the ranch's winter survival, Clara felt something loosen in her chest. They'd done it. Despite everything, despite her inexperience and mistakes, they delivered the herd on time and secured the contract. Congratulations, Miss Hale, the buyer said, tipping his hat. Pleasure doing business with you. Elias always ran a quality operation. Glad to see it's continuing under new management. Clara accepted the compliment with as much grace as she could muster, painfully aware that she'd contributed almost nothing to the quality he was praising. That was all Elias's legacy, Caleb's expertise, the crew's hard work. But she'd been there. She'd made the journey, survived the hardships, learned from her mistakes. That had to count for something. The crew dispersed into town with their pay, leaving Clara and Caleb standing in the stockyard watching the last of the cattle get processed. You should celebrate, Caleb said quietly. This was a success. It was your success. I just tagged along. You didn't just tag along. He turned to face her fully. You showed up, Clara. That matters more than you think. Elias left you an operation, and you could have sold it, or abandoned it, or hired someone to run it while you stayed comfortable at the ranch house. Instead, you got on a horse and rode 5 days through storms and river crossings in your own fear. That's not nothing. Clara looked down at the bank draft in her hands. Proof of the ranch's viability, security for the winter ahead. What happens now? Now we rest tonight, resupply tomorrow, and head back. Winter's almost here, and we've got work waiting. Caleb paused. Unless you want to stay in Cheyenne for a while. There are hotels, restaurants, things you haven't seen in months. The offer was tempting, a real bed, hot water, food that wasn't cooked over an open fire. But Clara found herself shaking her head. The ranch is home now. Might as well get back to it. Something in Caleb's expression softened. All right then, let's find the crew and make sure they don't spend all their pay in one night. We've got a long ride home ahead of us. They found rooms at a modest boarding house that smelled like lye soap and old wood. Clara's room was small and plain, but the bed was soft and the water in the pitcher was actually warm. She stripped off her filthy traveling clothes, washed as thoroughly as the basin allowed, and fell asleep before the sun fully set. She woke disoriented in full darkness, her body still expecting the hard ground and the sounds of cattle. For a moment she panicked, reaching for dangers that weren't there, before remembering where she was. Cheyenne. Safety. A successful delivery behind them. Sleep wouldn't return, so Clara dressed and went downstairs. The boarding house had a small parlor where a few other guests sat reading or playing cards. She found an empty chair near the window and watched the street outside, trying to reconcile this version of herself with the woman who'd left Boston 2 months ago. Can't sleep either. She turned to find Caleb in the doorway, looking as restless as she felt. He'd cleaned up too, shaved, changed clothes, though his eyes still carried the exhaustion of the past week. Too quiet, Clara said. Strange how quickly you adjust to discomfort. Happens to everyone. He settled into the chair across from her, close enough for conversation but maintaining the careful distance they'd kept since the river crossing. Your body needs time to remember it's allowed to relax. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching other residents come and go. A woman with 2 small children hurried past, the kids arguing about something in high, carrying voices. An older gentleman settled in with a newspaper, muttering about political news Clara couldn't follow. Can I ask you something? Clara said finally. Caleb nodded. During the storm, when you found me on the ground, you were afraid, not just angry. Why? He was quiet long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. Because I made a promise to Elias. Not explicitly, but it was there between us. He trusted me to help you succeed, and losing you 5 days into a cattle drive would have meant I failed him. Caleb paused, jaw working. And because somewhere in the past 2 months, I started caring whether you lived or died for reasons that had nothing to do with Elias. The admission hung between them, neither quite friendship nor something more, existing in undefined territory. Clara wasn't sure how to navigate. I care whether you live or die too, she said quietly. For what that's worth. It's worth something. Caleb's expression was unreadable in the dim parlor light. You should get more sleep. We're leaving early. He stood and left before Clara could respond, disappearing up the stairs with that efficient gait she'd come to recognize. Clara remained in the chair, turning his words over in her mind, trying to understand what they meant and what she wanted them to mean. The return journey was easier without cattle to manage, though winter was making its presence known. They rode hard, covering distance quickly, racing the weather that threatened from darkening skies. Clara's body had adapted to the saddle during the drive, and she kept pace without complaint, earning nods of approval from the crew. They stopped only once in Sweetwater Springs to resupply before pushing on to the ranch. When the valley finally came into view on the 3rd day, Clara felt something unexpected. Relief. Genuine relief at seeing those buildings, that land, the home she'd inherited from a stranger, and somehow made her own. The ranch looked different under threatening skies. Smaller, maybe, or more vulnerable. Tom rode up beside her as they descended into the valley. Storm's coming, he said, reading the clouds with experienced eyes. Big one, from the look of it. We'll need to secure everything tonight. Make sure the stock has shelter and feed. Clara nodded, already mentally listing tasks she'd learned over the past months. Check the barn, reinforce weak points, bring horses in close, stock firewood. The knowledge was there now, buried in muscle memory and hard-won experience. They spent the evening preparing, working past dark to secure the ranch against the incoming weather. By the time Clara collapsed into her own bed, still strange to think of it that way, the first snowflakes were falling. The storm hit with brutal force around midnight. Wind screamed against the house, rattling windows and finding every gap in the walls. Snow fell so thick Clara couldn't see the barn from her bedroom window. She lay awake listening to the house creak and settle, hoping the preparations they'd made would be enough. Morning brought a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the buildings in great white waves, burying fences and obscuring the familiar landscape. The temperature had dropped viciously, the kind of cold that burned exposed skin and made breathing painful. Caleb appeared at her door as Clara was building up the fire. We need to check the stock. Some of the cattle didn't make it to shelter before the worst hit. They bundled in every layer they owned and ventured into the white chaos. The wind had died down, but the cold was relentless. Clara followed Caleb through drifts that sometimes reached her waist, Sage trudging gamely behind them. They found 3 dead steers in the north pasture, frozen where they'd huddled against a rock outcropping. The sight made Clara's stomach turn, but Caleb's expression remained neutral. Not as bad as it could be, lost 20 head in the blizzard of 75. He checked the remaining cattle, assessing their condition with practiced efficiency. These ones will make it if we can get them closer to the barn. They spent hours moving cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, distributing feed. By the time they returned to the house, Clara's hands were numb despite her gloves, and her face felt like leather. "Welcome to Wyoming winter," Caleb said, deadpan, as they stamped snow off their boots. "Gets worse before it gets better." The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of brutal cold, constant maintenance, and the kind of exhausting work that left Clara too tired to think. She and Caleb developed a routine: early morning check of the stock, repairs as needed, evening preparations for whatever the night might bring. The crew was trapped in the bunkhouse, venturing out only for essential tasks. Jesse got frostbite on 2 fingers despite his gloves. Tom developed a cough that worried everyone until it finally cleared. The ranch became a small island of survival in a frozen sea, every decision weighted by the knowledge that mistakes could be fatal. On the 4th morning, Clara woke to silence. The wind had stopped. She went to the window and found the world still and white and blindingly beautiful under a clear sky. Caleb was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, making coffee with the automatic movements of someone who'd barely slept. "Storm's passed," he said without preamble. "We'll need to dig out today, check for damage, see what we lost." They worked alongside the crew, clearing paths between buildings, assessing the storm's toll. They'd lost 5 head of cattle total, 2 sections of fence, and part of the barn roof. Expensive, but not catastrophic. The ranch had survived its first major winter storm under Clara's ownership. That evening, Tom found Clara in the barn doing inventory of damaged equipment. "Got a minute?" "Sure." Clara set down the broken halter she'd been examining. "What's on your mind?" Tom settled onto a hay bale with the carefulness of old joints protesting cold weather. "Wanted to talk about winter plans. We're looking at 3, maybe 4 more months of this weather. Not every storm will be that bad, but we'll have more coming." "I know." Clara had been studying Elias's records from previous winters, understanding now why he'd been so focused on the Cheyenne delivery. That money had to last until spring. "Thing is," Tom continued, "some of the hands usually head south for winter. Find work in warmer climates. Come back when the thaw starts. Fewer mouths to feed, less pressure on winter stores." Clara's chest tightened. "Are you leaving?" "Me? No. I'm too old to keep moving around. This is home now." Tom's weathered face creased into something almost like a smile. "But Jesse and a few of the younger ones, they're thinking about it. Wanted you to know before they asked for winter release." "That's fine. They should do what's best for them." Clara tried to keep disappointment out of her voice. She'd come to rely on Jesse's good humor during difficult days. "They'll be back in spring," Tom assured her. "It's not abandonment, just practical. Ranch can run lean through winter with me, Caleb, and maybe 2 others, save money, reduce risk." Clara nodded, understanding the logic, even as she hated the reality of it. "Tell them they have my blessing, and jobs waiting when they return." Tom left her to her inventory, but the conversation stayed with Clara. She'd known intellectually that winter would be hard, but the emotional reality of it was settling in now. Months of cold, reduced crew, isolation, constant battle against weather and scarcity. Jesse and 3 others left 2 days later, heading south with promises to return in April. Their departure left the ranch feeling emptier, the work falling on fewer shoulders. Clara threw herself into learning everything Tom and Caleb could teach about winter management. How to calculate feed ratios to make supplies last. How to spot hypothermia in cattle before it became fatal. How to repair equipment in conditions where metal became brittle and fingers wouldn't bend properly. The days developed a rhythm, brutal but predictable. Morning check of the stock, maintenance work during whatever daylight they had, evening preparations, early darkness, repeat. Clara fell into bed exhausted every night and woke to do it again. December arrived with more snow and the kind of cold that made the earlier storm seem mild. Clara learned to wrap her face against the wind, to work in layers she could shed and add as needed, to judge by sky and animal behavior when another storm was brewing. She also learned the particular isolation of winter in Wyoming territory. They were snowed in for days at a time, unable to reach town or receive visitors. The world contracted to just the ranch, just the valley, just the people and animals struggling to survive until spring. It was during one of those isolated stretches that Clara's relationship with Caleb shifted again. They'd finished evening chores and were sitting in the main house. Caleb had taken to checking in with her each night, ostensibly to discuss the next day's work, but really, Clara suspected, because the isolation was getting to him too. They'd fallen into the habit of sharing coffee and conversation before he returned to the bunkhouse. "How are supplies holding?" Caleb asked, warming his hands on his cup. "Better than expected. We're using less feed than Elias projected, and the meat stores should last through February easily." Clara consulted the ledger she'd been maintaining. "The real concern is if we lose more cattle. Every head we lose is income we can't replace until spring sales." "We won't lose more if we can help it." Caleb's voice carried the determination Clara had come to recognize, the refusal to accept defeat even when circumstances were stacked against them. They reviewed numbers and plans, but eventually the conversation drifted to other topics. Caleb told her about growing up in Ohio, the farm his family had lost during the war, the reasons he'd gone west looking for something he couldn't name. Clara shared more about Boston, her father's failures, the suffocating social expectations she'd been desperate to escape. "Do you miss it?" Caleb asked. "The city, your old life." Clara considered the question honestly. "I miss my mother. I miss knowing what I was doing and feeling competent, but the life itself? No. I was drowning there, just slowly enough that nobody noticed. And here? Here I'm drowning differently." Clara smiled without humor. "But at least it's my choice to be in the water." Caleb was quiet for a moment, firelight throwing shadows across his face. "You're not drowning, Clara. You're swimming. There's a difference. Tell that to my aching body." "Everyone's body aches out here. It's the price of the work." He set down his cup, meeting her eyes directly. "But you're doing more than surviving. You're actually running this place, making decisions, managing resources, earning respect from people who don't give it easily." The praise made Clara uncomfortable in a way criticism never did. "I'm just doing what needs doing. That's exactly why it matters." Caleb stood, preparing to leave as he always did before the conversation could get too personal. "Get some rest. We've got fence repairs tomorrow if the weather holds." But at the door he paused, hand on the frame, not quite looking back. "For what it's worth, I think Elias would be proud of what you've built here." "I know I am." He left before Clara could respond, the door closing against the cold night. She sat alone in the kitchen, his words echoing in the sudden silence, feeling the weight of them settle somewhere deep in her chest. The fence repairs the next day were miserable work. The cold made the wire difficult to handle and the posts resistant to being reset. Clara worked alongside Caleb and Tom, her hands going numb despite heavy gloves, but she refused to quit before the job was done. "You're tougher than you look," Tom observed when they finally finished. City girl turned ranch hand, never thought I'd see it. "Neither did I," Clara admitted. "Turns out desperation is a powerful teacher." Tom laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "Desperation and stubbornness. Good combination out here." They returned to the house to find a rider approaching through the snow, the first visitor they'd had in weeks. Clara's hand automatically went to the rifle Caleb had insisted she keep close, but Tom shook his head. "That's Sheriff Morrison from town. Official business, most likely." The sheriff was a tired-looking man in his 50s, bundled against the cold, but clearly uncomfortable on horseback. He dismounted stiffly and accepted the coffee Caleb offered with obvious gratitude. "Appreciate the hospitality. Been riding since dawn." Morrison wrapped his hands around the cup. "I'm here on official business, Miss Hale. There's been accusations." Clara's stomach dropped. "What kind of accusations?" "Marcus Bellamy claims you've been cutting his fences and driving his cattle onto your land. Says he's got witnesses and property damage to prove it." The accusation was so absurd Clara almost laughed. "Sheriff, I've barely left this ranch since the snow started. How would I be sabotaging Bellamy's property?" "That's what I figured, but I had to come out and ask official-like." Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Thing is, Bellamy's pushing hard on this. He wants compensation or he's threatening legal action. Legal action for something I didn't do." Clara felt anger rising, hot and sharp. "He's been trying to force me out since Elias died. This is just another tactic." "Probably," Morrison agreed, "but I still have to investigate. Need to see your crew, check your cattle counts, Make sure nothing looks suspicious. They spent 2 hours showing the sheriff around, the cattle all accounted for, the crew vouching for Clara's constant presence at the ranch, the complete lack of evidence supporting Bellamy's claims. Morrison took notes, but his skepticism about the accusations was obvious. "I'll file my report saying I found nothing to support Bellamy's claims," he said before leaving. "But Miss Hale, I'll be honest with you, he's not going to stop. Man like that, he sees you as an obstacle between him and what he wants. The fact that you're a woman makes it worse in his mind. He'll keep pushing until something breaks. Then he'll be disappointed when it's not me that breaks," Clara said firmly. Morrison tipped his hat. "I hope you're right, but watch yourself. And keep good records of everything. If this goes legal, you'll need documentation." After the sheriff left, Caleb found Clara in the barn, taking out her frustration on a pile of hay that needed moving. "He's escalating," Caleb said quietly. "The false accusations, the legal threats. He's testing your defenses, seeing where you're vulnerable." "I know." Clara drove the pitchfork into another bale harder than necessary. "What do I do about it?" "Stay clean, document everything. Don't give him ammunition." Caleb paused. "And be prepared for it to get worse before it gets better. Men like Bellamy don't accept defeat gracefully." Clara set down the pitchfork, facing him directly. "Are you saying I should sell? That fighting him isn't worth it?" "No. I'm saying you should go into this fight with your eyes open." Caleb's expression was serious. "If you want to keep this ranch, you'll have to defend it. Not just against weather and economics, but against people who want to take it from you. That's the reality." "I can handle reality." Clara's voice came out stronger than she felt. "I've handled everything else so far." "You have." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, respect mixed with concern. "Just remember you're not alone in this. Whatever Bellamy throws at you, the crew and I are with you." It was the closest he'd come to directly stating loyalty, and Clara felt the weight of it. "Thank you." They stood in the barn with winter pressing in around them, and Clara understood that this was what her life had become. Hard work, constant challenges, and the strange comfort of people who'd chosen to stand beside her. The weeks that followed were tense. They waited for Bellamy's next move, for another accusation or threat or act of sabotage. But winter itself became the more immediate enemy. Another major storm trapped them for 5 days. 2 more cattle were lost to the cold. The supplies that had seemed adequate started looking thin. Clara spent long nights with the ledgers, calculating and recalculating, trying to find margin where none existed. If they lost more stock, if spring came late, if the prices dropped when they went to sell, any of those scenarios could tip them from surviving to failing. "You'll make yourself sick worrying," Tom told her one evening when he found her still working past midnight. "Numbers don't change just because you stare at them harder. They might reveal a solution I haven't seen yet." Clara rubbed her tired eyes. "There has to be something I'm missing." "What you're missing is sleep." Tom took the ledger from her hands with grandfatherly firmness. "Go to bed, Miss Hale. Problems that can't be solved tonight won't be solved by exhaustion either." Clara wanted to argue but couldn't. She was exhausted, wrung out by months of constant vigilance and work. She climbed the stairs feeling every one of her 22 years and a few extra besides. Sleep came hard, her mind churning through problems even as her body demanded rest. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were full of numbers and frozen cattle and Bellamy's cold smile. She woke to gray dawn light and the sound of someone pounding on the front door. Clara grabbed her robe and hurried downstairs to find Caleb already there, facing one of Bellamy's ranch hands. "Message from Mr. Bellamy," the man said, holding out a sealed envelope. "Said it's time sensitive." Caleb took the envelope with barely concealed hostility. "Tell your boss if he wants to communicate, he can come in person instead of sending messengers before dawn." The hand shrugged and rode off. Caleb handed Clara the envelope, and she broke the seal with fingers that trembled slightly from cold and apprehension. The message was brief and direct. "Miss Hale, I'm prepared to make one final offer for your property. $15,000, immediate payment, deal closed by end of January. After that, my offer is withdrawn permanently, and you'll be on your own against whatever comes. Think carefully. Emsa Bellamy." Clara read it twice, then handed it to Caleb. His expression darkened as he scanned the contents. "That's more than his first offer," he said carefully. "Still less than it's worth, but not insulting." Is this the part where you tell me to consider it seriously? This is the part where I remind you that decision is entirely yours. Caleb met her eyes. 15,000 would set you up comfortably somewhere else. No more frozen cattle, no more fighting men like Bellamy, no more wondering if you'll make it through the next season. It would also mean giving him what he wants, proving that pressure works, that women can be scared off with enough intimidation. Claire's voice hardened. And it would mean abandoning everything Elias built, everything we've all worked for. True. Caleb was quiet for a moment. So what are you going to do? Clara looked out the window at the snow-covered valley, the land that had demanded everything from her and given back something she couldn't quite name. Security, maybe. Purpose. The first real sense that she was building something instead of just surviving someone else's choices. I'm going to write back and tell Bellamy that the ranch isn't for sale at any price, she said firmly, and then I'm going to figure out how to make sure he can never force me out. Caleb smiled. Not his usual measured expression, but something genuinely warm. Good. I was hoping you'd say that. Even though it's probably the stupid choice, courage and stupidity sometimes look the same, he quoted back at her, using Tom's words from the cattle drive. But this time, I think it's courage. Clara wrote the response to Bellamy that same morning, her handwriting steady despite the anger coursing through her veins. She kept it brief, professional, and unambiguous. The ranch was not for sale, would never be for sale, and further communications on the matter were unwelcome. She signed it, sealed it, and sent it back with Tom when he rode into Sweetwater Springs for supplies 2 days later. You sure about this? Tom asked before leaving, Bellamy's letter tucked in his coat pocket. Man's offering you a way out. I don't want a way out. I want what's mine. Clara met his eyes steadily. And I want him to know that intimidation doesn't work on me. Tom nodded slowly, something like pride crossing his weathered features. All right then, but he won't take this well. I'm counting on it. Men who lose their temper make mistakes. After Tom left, Clara found Caleb in the barn checking the remaining horses. The winter had been hard on them, too, their coats thick against the cold, their movements careful on ice-slicked ground. I sent the letter, she said without preamble. Caleb didn't look up from the hoof he was examining. Good. What happens now? Now we prepare for whatever he does next. Clara leaned against the stall door, watching him work with the easy competence she'd come to appreciate. And we make sure the ranch is so well documented and legally sound that he can't find leverage anywhere. You've been thinking about this. I haven't been thinking about much else. Clara pulled Elias's journal from her coat pocket. She'd taken to carrying it lately, finding strange comfort in his observations. Elias wrote about Bellamy's tactics. The man's patient when he thinks patience will work, but vicious when it won't. We're entering the vicious phase. Caleb finally looked up, his expression serious. Then we need to be smarter, not just tougher. What did you have in mind? They spent the next hour planning, and Claire felt something shift between them. This wasn't Caleb instructing her or protecting her. This was partnership. They were building strategy together, two people who'd learned to trust each other's judgment through months of shared hardship. We should also consider allies, Caleb said eventually. Other ranchers who've dealt with Bellamy's expansion tactics, strength in numbers. You think they'd support a woman rancher against an established man? I think they'd support their own interests. And a strong ranch run by someone who honors contracts is better for everyone than Bellamy controlling more territory. Caleb paused. Worth trying, anyway. Clara nodded, adding it to her mental list. The list had grown long these past months, things to learn, problems to solve, battles to fight. But she was learning that the list never ended. You just got better at managing it. February arrived with a brief thaw that fooled everyone into hoping for early spring, then winter returned with renewed fury. Clara woke one morning to find the water in her washing basin frozen solid and frost patterns on the inside of the windows. She dressed in layers, went downstairs to build up the fire, and found Caleb already in the kitchen. This had become normal too, him appearing before dawn, making coffee, the two of them planning the day's work in comfortable silence before the world fully woke. Stock check first, he said, handing her a cup. Then we need to repair the south fence before the next storm hits. When's the next storm hitting? Tomorrow? Maybe the day after? Sky's got that look. He gestured toward the window where dawn was just breaking, pale and cold. We'll need to move fast. They worked through breakfast, then bundled against the cold and headed out. The cattle were huddled in groups, conserving heat, their breath creating small clouds in the frozen air. Clara had learned to assess them quickly now. Which ones were struggling, which were holding steady, which needed extra feed or shelter. "We're going to make it," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Caleb glanced at her. "To spring? To everything. Spring, next winter, whatever Bellamy throws at us. We're going to make it." "What makes you so sure?" Clara looked across the valley at the ranch buildings, the land that had tested her in every possible way. "Because we've made it this far. And because I'm too stubborn to fail now." Caleb's expression softened into something that might have been affection. "Stubbornness is a good quality in a rancher. So you keep telling me." They finished the stock check and moved on to fence repairs. The work was brutal. The cold made the wire brittle and the posts resistant to being moved. Clara's hands ached despite heavy gloves, and her face felt raw from wind exposure. But she kept working, matching Caleb's pace, refusing to be the one who quit first. Around midday, Tom appeared on horseback, riding faster than was safe given the ice. "Trouble," he called before he'd even dismounted. "Fire at the Morrison place in town. Started in the general store, spread to 3 other buildings before they got it under control." Clara's stomach dropped. The general store held their credit account, their supply records, proof of their business relationships. "How bad?" "Bad enough that Morrison's asking all his creditors to come in and verify their accounts before the records are completely lost. Says he'll honor what people claim, but he needs it documented now." "We need to go to town." Clara was already mentally calculating what they owed, what records she had at the ranch, what could be reconstructed from memory if necessary. "In this weather?" Caleb looked at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming, Clara. Riding to town now means getting caught in it. And not going means potentially losing our credit line and our business standing." Clara made the decision quickly. "I'm going. You stay here. Manage the ranch if I don't make it back before the storm." "Not happening." Caleb's voice was flat. "If you're going, I'm going with you. Tom can handle things here." They argued briefly, but Clara knew she'd lost before she started. Caleb wasn't going to let her ride alone in deteriorating weather, and honestly, she was grateful for it. They saddled fresh horses, packed minimal supplies, and headed toward Sweetwater Springs at a pace that balanced urgency with safety. The ride took 2 hours through increasingly hostile conditions. Wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across the prairie. Visibility dropped until Clara could barely see Caleb riding beside her. The cold was penetrating, the kind that found every gap in clothing and settled into bones. They reached Sweetwater Springs as the storm intensified. The town looked battered. 3 buildings on Main Street were charred ruins, still smoking despite the snow. People moved through the streets with the purposeful urgency of a community trying to salvage what it could before conditions got worse. Morrison's temporary office was in the church basement, records spread across makeshift tables while the shopkeeper worked frantically to document what remained. He looked up when Clara and Caleb entered, relief crossing his face. "Miss Hale, thank heaven. I've got most of your account details, but I need you to verify purchases from the last 3 months." They spent the next hour reconstructing records, Clara's careful documentation proving invaluable. She'd kept copies of everything at the ranch, receipts, ledger entries, correspondence. Morrison matched her records against his damaged books, and gradually they pieced together an accurate account. "You're one of the few who kept this detailed," Morrison said with obvious appreciation. "Most folks rely on my records entirely. This helps more than you know." "Learn from Elias," Clara said simply. "He believed in documentation." By the time they finished, full darkness had fallen and the storm was raging. Morrison looked out the window with concern. "You can't ride back in this. Wind's too strong, visibility's gone. You'll get lost and freeze before you make it halfway." "We don't have much choice," Caleb said. "Ranch needs managing." "Tom's there," Clara countered. "And Morrison's right. Riding in this is suicide." She turned to the shopkeeper. "Is there somewhere we can wait it out?" Morrison directed them to the boarding house, the same one Clara had stayed at when she first arrived. The irony wasn't lost on her as she climbed those familiar stairs, this time with Caleb following behind. They got separate rooms. Propriety still mattered, even in emergencies, but ended up in Clara's because it had the better stove. They sat on opposite sides of the small room, slowly thawing, listening to the storm rage outside. This reminds me of the cattle drive, Clara said eventually. Trapped by weather, nothing to do but wait. Except this time we're not sleeping on frozen ground. Caleb's voice carried exhaustion and something else, a careful tension Clara was beginning to recognize. True, though I'm not sure this mattress is much better than frozen ground. She smiled slightly. I've gotten soft, haven't I? A few months ago I would have thought this room was luxury. You've gotten tougher, not softer. There's a difference. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret it? Coming west, taking on the ranch, everything that's happened? Clara considered the question honestly. I regret that Elias died. I regret not meeting him, not getting the chance to build what we'd planned. But regret coming here? No. Even with everything, the work, the danger, Bellamy, the constant uncertainty, I'd rather be here struggling for something that's mine than back in Boston, drowning in someone else's expectations. Even though it would be easier, easier isn't always better. Clara met his eyes across the dim room. I learned that from you, actually. Watching you choose the hard work of building something over the easy comfort of drifting. Caleb looked away, jaw working. I'm not that noble. I just didn't have anywhere else to go. Neither did I. But we're both still here, choosing to stay when we could have left a dozen times over. That has to mean something. The silence that followed felt charged with things neither of them was quite ready to say. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the small room, Clara felt strangely safe, protected not just by walls, but by the presence of someone who understood what she'd survived to get here. We should get some rest, Caleb said finally, standing. Storm might break by morning. Caleb, Clara stopped him at the door, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing she couldn't let him leave without saying something. Thank you. For coming with me. For staying when you could have gone, for all of it. He turned, and in the lamplight his expression was unguarded for once. I didn't stay for the ranch, Clara. I stayed for you. He left before she could respond, the door closing quietly behind him. Clara sat alone in the small room, his words echoing in the sudden silence, feeling the weight of them settle somewhere deep in her chest where they rearranged everything she thought she understood about their relationship. Sleep was impossible. She lay awake listening to the storm, thinking about Caleb's admission, trying to understand what it meant and what she wanted it to mean. Somewhere in the months since arriving, he'd become more than just the foreman or Elias's loyal friend. He'd become the person she trusted most, the one she turned to in crisis, the presence that made the ranch feel like home instead of just property. When had that happened? During the cattle drive, when he'd been furious at her for taking risks? During the long winter when they'd worked side by side, keeping everything alive? Or maybe earlier, in those first weeks when he'd taught her to ride and hadn't treated her like she was foolish for trying? Morning brought clearer skies and the kind of cold that hurt to breathe. Clara dressed and went downstairs to find Caleb already there, drinking coffee and looking like he'd slept about as well as she had. Storm's passed, he said without meeting her eyes. We should head back. They rode in silence, the tension between them different than before. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with unspoken things. The landscape was transformed by snow, familiar landmarks buried or reshaped. Twice they had to stop and reorient themselves, making sure they were still heading the right direction. They were an hour from the ranch when Clara saw the smoke. Caleb! Her voice came out sharp with fear. Is that the ranch? He was already urging his horse faster. Could be chimney smoke, could be trouble. They pushed hard, covering the remaining distance at dangerous speed given the conditions. As they crested the ridge above the valley, Clara's worst fears materialized. The barn was burning, flames visible even in daylight, black smoke pouring into the clear sky. They rode into chaos. Tom and the remaining hands were fighting the fire with everything they had. Water buckets, blankets, desperate attempts to contain the blaze before it spread to other buildings. The cattle were panicking, the horses screaming from their corral. Clara dismounted before Sage fully stopped, running toward the fire. Caleb grabbed her arm, holding her back. Get the horses out, he ordered. Get them away from the barn before the whole structure comes down. Clara ran to the corral, threw open the gate, and started driving horses toward the open pasture. They needed no encouragement, bolting away from the smoke and flames. She counted heads frantically. They were all there, all accounted for. She turned back to find Caleb and Tom trying to save what they could from the barn. equipment, supplies, anything not yet consumed by flames. Clara joined them, grabbing what she could carry, coughing from smoke, feeling the heat on her face. "It's gone," Tom finally said, pulling them back. "Nothing more we can do. Let it burn out safely." They stood in a line watching the barn collapse in on itself, months of work and irreplaceable supplies disappearing into ash and smoke. Clara felt tears on her face, from smoke or grief or fury. She couldn't tell. "How did it start?" she asked when she could trust her voice. Tom's expression was grim. "Found kerosene cans in the snow outside. This wasn't an accident, Miss Hale. Someone set this deliberately." The rage that swept through Clara was physical, heating her from the inside despite the cold. "Bellamy." "Can't prove it," Tom warned, "but the timing's suspicious, right after you refused his offer." "I don't need proof. I know." Clara watched the flames consume what remained of the structure. "He's escalating. First false accusations, now arson. What's next?" "We should report this to Sheriff Morrison," Caleb said quietly. "Get it documented, even if we can't prove who did it." They spent the rest of the day managing the aftermath. The barn was a total loss, along with most of their stored hay, spare equipment, and supplies meant to last until spring. The financial impact was devastating. The emotional impact was worse. That evening, Clara sat alone in the house, doing calculations that all led to the same conclusion. They couldn't survive this loss and still make it through winter. Not without selling off cattle at terrible prices, or taking loans they couldn't repay, or accepting Bellamy's offer. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral. Caleb entered without waiting for permission, took one look at her face, and closed the door behind him. "Let me see the numbers," he said. "There's no point. We're finished." Clara's voice was flat with defeat. "Even if we sell half the remaining cattle, we won't have enough for feed and spring operations. We're done." "Show me the numbers anyway." She did, spreading the ledgers across the table with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and suppressed emotion. Caleb studied them in silence, and Clara watched his expression darken as he reached the same conclusion she had. "You're right," he said finally. "As things stand, we can't make it." "I know. But that's as things stand." Caleb looked up, and Clara saw something fierce in his expression. "What if we change the variables? What if we don't wait for spring sales? What if we take the remaining cattle to market now, before Bellamy expects it, and use that capital to rebuild?" Clara's mind raced through the implications. Early sale means lower prices. Some, but we'd have cash immediately. Could rebuild essential structures, buy feed for the breeding stock we keep, maybe even expand if we're smart about it. It's risky. If the prices are too low, everything's risky. But this way we're acting instead of reacting. Bellamy burned the barn expecting it to break us. What if instead it pushes us to adapt faster than he anticipates? Clara felt hope kindle despite her exhaustion. "You think we could actually pull this off?" "I think we don't have many other options. But yes, I think if we move fast and smart, we could turn this disaster into opportunity." Caleb paused. "It's your decision, Clara. Your ranch. Your risk." She looked at the numbers again, running calculations with this new variable included. It was tight, depended on getting decent prices and managing perfectly, but it could work. It could actually work. "How fast can we organize a sale?" Caleb's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. "Tom and I can have the herd ready in 2 days. We send word ahead to buyers in Cheyenne and Denver, create a bidding situation instead of taking what's offered. Risky, but potentially more profitable." "Do it." Clara's voice was steady now, energized by having a plan. "And Caleb, thank you for not letting me give up." "You weren't giving up. You were processing." He stood, preparing to leave, then stopped. "What I said at the boarding house." "I know." Clara met his eyes. "We'll talk about it after we've saved the ranch." Something passed between them. Understanding and promise, and the acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Then Caleb left to start preparations, and Clara returned to her ledgers with renewed purpose. The next 3 weeks were controlled chaos. They organized the sale, contacted buyers, prepared the herd for early market. Tom rode to Cheyenne to set up the auction while Caleb and Clara managed the ranch. Sheriff Morrison came out, documented the arson, but as expected couldn't prove Bellamy's involvement. "Man's careful," Morrison said, frustrated. "Uses intermediaries, covers his tracks. but everyone knows it was him. Knowing and proving are different, Clara said. I'm learning that lesson. The sale happened in mid-March, earlier than anyone expected. Buyers came from 3 territories, and the bidding was competitive. Clara watched from the auction yard fence as her cattle sold for better prices than she'd dared hope. When the final gavel fell, Caleb found her and delivered the news. We made it. Not just made it. We came out ahead. Enough to rebuild the barn, stock supplies, and have surplus for spring. Clara felt tears on her face again, but this time from relief. We actually did it. You did it. Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. You refused to break when Bellamy tried to break you. You found another way forward. They stood together in the Cheyenne auction yard, and Clara understood that this was the moment, the choice between continuing as they had been or acknowledging what had grown between them. Caleb, what you said about staying for me, I meant it. He finally met her eyes fully. I know it's complicated. I was Elias's foreman, you inherited his ranch. There's propriety in business relationships and 100 reasons this doesn't make sense. But somewhere in the last 6 months, I stopped seeing you as the woman who replaced Elias and started seeing you as Clara. And I can't pretend that didn't happen. Clara's heart was racing. I see you too. As Caleb, not just the foreman or Elias's friend. As the person who taught me to survive here, who stood beside me when I had every reason to fail, who believed I could do this when I didn't believe it myself. So where does that leave us? I don't know. Clara was being honest. I came here expecting to marry a stranger out of necessity. Instead, I inherited a ranch and found something I wasn't looking for. You, this, whatever this is. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I'm not Elias. I don't own land. I don't have money saved up. I can't offer you the security he promised. I don't need you to be Elias. I need you to be you. Clara took a breath, making the leap. And I need you to know that if you're asking what I think you're asking, my answer is yes. I haven't asked anything yet. Then ask. Caleb's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something Clara had never seen there before. Hope. Clara Hale, will you marry me? Not because you need security or because it's practical, but because somewhere in this frozen hell of a territory, I fell in love with your stubbornness and your courage and the way you refuse to break no matter what gets thrown at you. Clara felt laughter bubble up despite tears. That's possibly the worst proposal I've ever heard. It's the only proposal you've ever heard. You never actually met Elias. Fair point. She stepped closer, close enough to see the uncertainty in his eyes despite his steady voice. Yes, Caleb. Yes, I'll marry you. Because I fell in love with your loyalty and your honesty and the way you push me to be stronger than I think I am. He kissed her then, there in the Cheyenne auction yard with buyers and sellers walking past. And Clara understood that this was nothing like what she'd imagined when she boarded that train in Boston. This was better, harder, messier, more real than any careful arrangement could have been. They returned to the ranch as the first signs of spring appeared, patches of bare ground showing through snow, ice beginning to break up on the creek, the promise of warmth after months of brutal cold. The crew who'd gone south for winter started trickling back, Jesse among them. Heard about the barn, Jesse said when he arrived. Heard you turned it around, though. That true? True enough, Claire confirmed. We're rebuilding. Should be done before summer. And I heard something else. Jesse's grin was infectious. Congratulations on your engagement, Miss Hale. Or should I say, soon-to-be Mrs. Mercer. The wedding happened in late April, on the ranch under open sky, with the crew and half of Sweetwater Springs in attendance. It was nothing like the formal Boston wedding Clara might have had in another life. It was better. Tom officiated, reading from a book of common law marriage rights, his weathered voice carrying across the valley. Clara wore a simple dress she'd bought in Cheyenne, practical and pretty in equal measure. Caleb wore new clothes but looked uncomfortable in them, and Clara loved him for it. Do you, Clara Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, in prosperity and hardship, in health and sickness, for as long as you both shall live? Clara looked at Caleb, at the man who'd taught her to survive, who'd stood beside her through every crisis, who'd seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. I do. And do you, Caleb Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, in prosperity and hardship, in health and sickness, for as long as you both shall live? Caleb's voice was steady, certain. I do. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." He did, thoroughly, to cheers from the assembled crowd. When they broke apart, Clara looked around at the ranch, at the rebuilt barn, the grazing cattle, the land that had tested her in every possible way and somehow become home. She thought about Elias, about the life they'd planned in careful letters but never lived. She hoped wherever he was, he understood that she'd honored his legacy the best way she knew how, by refusing to let his ranch die, by building something permanent from the ruins of their unconsummated partnership. The celebration lasted into evening, with food and music and the kind of joy that only comes after surviving something difficult together. Clara danced with Caleb under the stars, both of them clumsy but happy, learning this new rhythm just as they'd learned everything else, through trial and error and stubborn persistence. Later, when the guests had gone and they were alone in the house that was now truly theirs, Caleb pulled Clara close. "Any regrets?" he asked. Clara thought about the question seriously. "I regret that my mother didn't live to see this. I regret that Elias died before I could meet him. I regret the barn burning and the cattle we lost and a dozen other hardships. But regret choosing this life? Regret choosing you? Never. Even though it's going to keep being hard? Even though Bellamy's still out there and next winter will come and ranching never gets easier? Especially because of that." Clara met his eyes. "I came here thinking I needed someone to save me. Instead, I learned to save myself. And then I found you, not as a savior, but as a partner. That's worth more than easy comfort ever could be." Caleb kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "I don't know what I did to deserve you. You stayed. When you could have left, could have found easier work elsewhere, you stayed. That's what you did." They stood together in the house they'd fought to keep, in the life they'd built from necessity and stubbornness and unexpected love. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed close, but inside they were warm and safe and home. Clara had learned that home wasn't a place you were given. It was something you fought for, built from the ground up, defended against those who would take it. She'd learned that love wasn't a transaction or a careful arrangement made through letters. It was choosing someone every day, in the hard moments and the quiet ones, building something real from honest foundations. She'd come west as a mail-order bride seeking security. She'd found instead something far more valuable, the strength to claim her own life, the courage to defend what mattered, and the unexpected grace of loving someone who saw her not as she wished to be but as she actually was, and loved her anyway. The ranch would face more challenges. Bellamy hadn't given up. He just retreated to plan his next move. Winter would return, demanding and merciless. The work would never end, the risks would never fully disappear, but Clara had learned she could handle it, all of it. Not alone, she'd never be alone again, but with Caleb beside her, with the crew's loyalty, with the knowledge that she'd earned her place here through sweat and tears and stubborn refusal to break. She thought about the girl who'd stepped off that train in Sweetwater Springs 6 months ago, terrified and displaced, clinging to a dead man's letters. That girl was gone, transformed by the harsh land and harder challenges into someone stronger, someone capable, someone who'd built a home from ruins and found love in the last place she expected. The future was uncertain. It always would be. But Clara had learned that certainty was overrated. What mattered was having the courage to face uncertainty, the strength to keep building even when everything fell apart, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the life you didn't plan turns out better than the one you did. She stood in Caleb's arms, in their house, on their land, under Wyoming's vast sky, and felt something she'd never quite felt before. Contentment. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. Not security and comfort, but security in knowing she could handle whatever came. That was worth more than any careful arrangement could ever be. That was worth everything. And that, Clara thought, was the truth she'd traveled half a continent to learn.